Mariam was not born fragile, but life, with its quiet, relentless weight, has a way of bending even the strongest until they forget what it means to stand tall. She was 29. Her brown eyes once held the dreams of someone who believed the world could be better. She had studied hard, loved deeply, believed that if she gave her best, life would give something back. But now, her hands shook, not from weakness, from everything she'd carried alone for far too long. Her mother had been everything. After her father left when she was still a girl, it was her mother who worked 2 jobs and came home with sore feet and soft hugs. Mariam learned early how to make rice, to walk her little sister to school, and to hide her sadness behind silence. Still, she grew up believing in kindness, until the world began to prove her wrong. The stroke had come suddenly. One moment, her mother was laughing at an old movie. The next, she collapsed, and nothing was the same. Weeks turned into months. Bills turned into threats. Friends turned into ghosts. Mariam found herself drowning in a sea of quiet desperation, holding her breath with a smile no one believed anymore. She prayed, every night, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in sobs. But God felt far, or maybe she just felt too unworthy to be heard. Then came the woman, impeccably dressed, voice smooth as satin. She said she had seen Mariam in the hospital cafeteria, quietly crying over a cracked phone and a credit card declined for the 3rd time that week. "There's a way," she said, laying a soft hand on hers. "It's elegant, discreet. No one will know. You'll be safe. You'll be helping your mother." Something in Mariam clenched, but desperation silences wisdom. She wanted to believe it wasn't what she feared, that it was just a temporary sacrifice, just a job. So she signed the contract. The jet was private. The penthouse suite in Dubai was breathtaking. They gave her new clothes, polished her speech, trained her to sit, smile, nod at the right time. She wasn't told much, only that she would be attending a private gala where her presence would be admired. "Just be gracious," they said. "Be beautiful." But when the night came, and she stepped into the grand ballroom with its golden light and hollow warmth, she knew. It wasn't admiration they were after. It was possession. Women were paraded like trophies. Their smiles looked painted on, their laughter rehearsed. Mariam stood in line, her dress hugging a dignity she was trying desperately to keep. Her name was announced, mispronounced, flattened, foreign, and then she walked forward. The heels bit into her skin, but she kept her pace steady. Her hands trembled, but she clasped them. Her heart ached, but she lifted her chin. She would not cry. She would not break. Not here. Not yet. And then he stood. Youssef. The room shifted when he did. Men stopped whispering. Bids paused. All eyes turned. He was tall, immaculately dressed, with a presence that silenced rather than demanded. He didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply raised his hand. And that was it. No one dared to outbid him. He didn't look at her with desire. He didn't even look like he saw her. It was business. A transaction. A man used to getting what he wanted, simply because he wanted it. Back in the car, hours later, Mariam sat in silence. The city's lights blurred against the tinted window. She tried to remember who she was before all this, but her mind couldn't find the shape of that girl anymore. She whispered, "God, I don't know if you still hear me, but I did this for her. Please, let that be enough." Her voice cracked, her hands clenched in her lap. She didn't want pity. She wanted purpose. She wanted to believe that something good could still grow from this broken soil. But in her soul, something sacred had already been buried. She had been auctioned, not admired, not respected, not chosen, auctioned, as if she weren't human. And though she still breathed, still walked, still hoped in some small, stubborn place deep inside, something in her had died that night, something she feared might never return. The palace in Doha was gold, without warmth. Walls gleamed, floors shone. Silence echoed in marble halls that felt more like a museum than a home. Mariam had been taken there the night after the auction. Not asked, not told, just brought. Like luggage, like a transaction completed and sealed. She had imagined that someone would speak to her, explain things, offer a room, perhaps a schedule, a purpose, but no one did. A housekeeper showed her to a suite and handed her a phone with limited access. Her passport was gone. Her identity now rested in the hands of the man who bought her, Youssef. She saw him only once that first week. He passed through the corridor without a glance, talking on his phone in a language she didn't understand. His voice was low, sharp, commanding. The staff froze at his presence. Mariam simply stepped aside like a shadow, a ghost in the palace. But she wasn't invisible to him. 2 days later, he summoned her, not with words but through a knock on her door and a gesture. She followed in silence. The room was a study, massive and cold. He sat behind a desk, glass in hand, staring. "You haven't tried to speak to me," he said at last. Mariam stood still, unsure if it was a question or an accusation. "You're not afraid of me?" She met his eyes for the first time. Calm, unmoved. "I am not afraid of silence," she replied softly. "And you've said nothing worth answering." His lips curled, not in amusement, but confusion. He had expected resistance, or maybe seduction, but not dignity. Most women in your position would be more grateful. "For what?" she asked, voice steady. "For being owned?" A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Anger? Intrigue? Even he wasn't sure. "You're bold," he muttered. "No, just not broken." And with that she left. The days that followed were still. Mariam kept to herself. She wasn't locked in, but she wasn't free either. She wandered the garden, cleaned her own suite, refused help. The staff began to watch her, not with contempt, but curiosity. She greeted them, gently, respectfully. She never raised her voice, never complained, but never bowed. She became a presence in the house that could not be ignored. Youssef noticed. One morning he invited her to breakfast. The table was long, too formal. He sat at one end, she at the other. Silver cutlery, linen napkins. But Mariam brought her own warmth. "Do you pray?" he asked as they ate. "Every day. And yet you're here." "Maybe because I pray." That puzzled him. He had everything: money, property, control. Yet none of it had ever given him peace. And here was a woman, quiet and unwanted, with eyes full of something he didn't understand. He tried to provoke her. "You don't hate me for what I did?" Mariam sipped her tea before answering. "If I hated you, I would become like you." He said nothing. Her words landed heavier than any insult. Hatred, she believed, was a chain, one she refused to wear. She was not passive. She was not submissive. But she had made peace with pain in a way that confused him. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She simply existed in the truth of who she was, and refused to let that be stolen. That, more than anything, disturbed him. Youssef had always been desired, feared, respected. Women bent to his will or chased his wealth. But this one, she saw through him, and not once had she faked affection. That evening he brought her gifts, a necklace, perfume, a designer bag. Mariam looked at them, then back at him. "I don't need these. They're yours," he insisted. "I'd rather have my name back." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "You took my identity, my voice, my choice. You don't get to fix that with glitter." She didn't raise her voice, didn't curse, just said it, calmly, directly, as if speaking to the man he could be, not the man he was. He didn't sleep that night. He walked the halls of his own palace like a stranger. His wealth felt small, his power hollow. How could someone who had nothing make him feel so exposed? In the days that followed, he began to observe her from afar, the way she spoke to the gardeners, the way she paused by the old chapel behind the palace wall, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer, the way she carried herself, like someone who had known humiliation but refused to carry bitterness. She wasn't there to change him. She wasn't trying to. She simply existed in truth, and that truth felt unbearable. She was in his house, but she wasn't his, and no matter what he gave, she would not offer what he most wanted: admiration. That was the price he couldn't buy, because for Mariam, freedom wasn't leaving the palace. It was refusing to give her soul to a man who had never asked for it with respect. She would serve tea. She would greet with kindness. She would live quietly, but she would never pretend. Her silence wasn't submission. It was resistance. And in that silence, Youssef began to hear something for the first time in years: his own emptiness. It was supposed to be just a quiet afternoon. Yusef had grown used to silence in the palace, but that day it felt heavier. The air was thick with something he couldn't name. Restlessness, perhaps. Or guilt. He found himself wandering toward the pool, not because he wanted leisure, but because he needed distance from his thoughts. The sun was low, the water shimmered, and there she was. Mariam, not dressed for display, not made up like before. She wore a simple linen shirt, loose pants, her hair tied back. She was kneeling by the poolside, rinsing small pots she used for her herbs, completely unaware of his presence. Yusef didn't speak. Something about the scene asked for stillness, for reverence. Then she turned, and time slowed. Her shirt, damp from water, clung slightly to her back, and that's when he saw it. The scar. A line, long and faded just below her shoulder blade. It wasn't fresh, but it was cruel. The kind of wound not caused by accident. The kind that held stories. His throat tightened. He had seen bruises before. On others. On those he chose not to care about. But this was different. This wasn't pity, this was shame. He stepped forward without thinking. What happened to your back? Mariam froze. She stood slowly, drying her hands on a towel, not meeting his gaze. You already know. Her voice was soft but firm. Yusef swallowed hard. He did that? She nodded once. No details, no drama, just truth. Why would you stay? He asked, unable to hold the question. Because I didn't know I was allowed to leave. She finally looked at him, and what he saw wasn't pain. It was clarity. There are cages made of words, she said. Some women grow up thinking silence is safety, that if they're quiet enough, kind enough, they won't be hurt. She took a breath. But silence doesn't protect, it just delays the wound. He sat down on the bench near the pool, elbows on knees, staring at the water. I've hurt people, he said quietly. I know, but not like that. Mariam didn't answer right away. Then she walked toward him, slow, calm, until they stood face to face. Hurt is not just about bruises, she said. It's about dignity, about seeing someone and choosing to unsee them. She sat beside him. The night you bought me, something broke. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't do. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't wonder why I stood so still. You just claimed what wasn't yours. Yusef couldn't breathe properly. Her words were cutting through walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. I don't say this to punish you, Mariam continued. I say it because someone has to. She looked at the water, eyes calm. You're not him, Yusef. But you've lived long enough without asking if the way you move through the world is healing anyone, or just leaving scars. A long silence fell between them. Then he whispered, that scar. I haven't stopped seeing it. Mariam nodded. Good. Maybe that's the beginning of something. He turned to her. Beginning of what? Of seeing. Truly seeing. Yusef sat back. The sun had dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the floor. I was raised to win, he said. To conquer, to never apologize. And how's that working out? She asked gently. He let out a dry breath, not quite a laugh. Lonely, he said. It's been lonely. Mariam's expression didn't change, but something softened in her shoulders. I don't need you to apologize, she said. I need you to change. For yourself. She stood, brushing dust from her pants. That scar is part of me, but it doesn't own me, and neither do you. She walked away then, not out of anger, not to make a point, simply because the conversation was complete. Yusef stayed there for a long time, watching the water, remembering the scar, remembering her voice. He thought of all the times he dismissed stories he didn't understand, of how easy it was to hide behind money, behind status, behind detachment. But he couldn't hide from this. Not anymore. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he opened his laptop, searched the name she had once whispered, the name of the man who hurt her, not to retaliate, not to threaten, just to know, to understand what she had walked through, and what kind of strength it took to sit beside him, the man who tried to own her and speak truth without hate. He didn't know it yet, but the scar on her back had done something he never expected. It silenced his pride and awakened his heart, and for the first time, Yusef wasn't trying to escape what he felt. He was letting it stay, letting it shape him, letting it hurt, because maybe the hurting was where real change could finally begin, and maybe, just maybe, that scar was not a mark of her pain, but the doorway to his healing, a reminder that some truths can't be ignored, and some scars were never meant to be hidden, only honored for what they awakened in those willing to finally see. It was the middle of the night when he woke up, not from noise, but from a silence too deep to ignore, the kind of silence that presses against your chest like a forgotten truth, heavy, unnamed. Youssef sat up in bed, the silk sheets tangled around him like vines. The air in his room felt thick. He couldn't breathe right, couldn't rest. Something had shifted in him and it would not let him go back to sleep. He rose, walked barefoot across the cold marble, and let his instincts guide him. No guards, no lights. Only the sound of his own breath and a question that had been growing louder in his mind with each passing day. Who am I without control? The hallway to the old chapel was narrow and unused. Most didn't even know it existed, a forgotten relic of a more spiritual ancestor, tucked into the back of the estate like an inconvenient memory. He had only been there once as a child, dragged by his grandmother during a thunderstorm. She had called it God's shelter. He had called it useless. But now his feet were leading him back. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, and then he saw her, Mariam, kneeling at the altar, alone, shoulders trembling in the candlelight. She didn't hear him, or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. Her head was bowed, her hands folded over her chest. Her voice was quiet, too quiet to be performance. She wasn't praying to impress. She was praying to survive. He froze. She began to speak. God, I'm tired. She paused. I'm tired of pretending I'm stronger than I am. Youssef's breath caught in his throat. I'm tired of holding it all together while falling apart inside. Her voice didn't waver, but it broke something in him. Each word felt like it had been pulled from the core of someone who had learned too young how to carry pain with dignity. I miss my mom. I miss my sister. I miss being someone. The chapel held its breath. I know I'm not worthless, she whispered, but sometimes I forget. There was silence. Then she looked up, eyes glistening in the candlelight. I don't want revenge. I don't want riches. I just want peace. She pressed her palms against her heart. Help me remember who I am in you, because I feel like no one sees me. And if you don't see me, I don't know how I'll keep going. Youssef leaned against the wall, unable to move. Her words were like arrows, not meant for him, but piercing just the same. She wasn't asking for a rescue. She was asking for restoration, not of her circumstances, of her soul. He had never heard anyone pray like that, not in the cold, memorized verses of rituals, but from the broken center of a heart still choosing to believe. She was raw, unfiltered, real, and it humbled him. He wasn't a man who prayed. His prayers had always been negotiations, pleas for gain, bargains masked as faith. But this was different. She was not begging. She was belonging, as if God were not distant, but near, as if he were the only one who truly knew her. And suddenly Youssef wanted that. Not the form, not the ritual, but the nearness, the connection, the peace. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching a woman who had lost everything still speak as if heaven listened. And then, almost instinctively, he whispered words into the dark. God, if you're listening to her, maybe you could listen to me too. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't planned. But it was honest. And it startled him. How easily it came. He had built a life out of self-protection, out of logic, strategy, walls. But tonight, all of it had cracked. Because of a woman who wasn't trying to change him, just trying to stay whole. He stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and returned to his room in silence. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. It was full of a woman's voice asking heaven for hope and stirring a man's soul from its sleep. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the stars, wondering if they saw him too, wondering if there had ever been a time when he was as real with himself as Mariam had just been with her God. He remembered his grandmother's hands, how she used to cup his face and say, God doesn't look at gold. He looks at the heart. He had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. The next morning, Mariam found a note outside her door. Simple, handwritten, no signature. It read, "I heard you, and I saw you. No one who prays like that is invisible. Not to heaven, not to me." She read the words twice, then a third time. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition. For so long, she had wondered if anyone really noticed her. Not the version of her they wanted, not the facade, but the soul. And now, someone had seen the most private moment of her soul, and didn't look away. She closed the door gently, and for the first time in months, she wept. Not from fear, not from loneliness, but because she finally knew she had been seen, and not as property, not as a prisoner, but as a person, a daughter, a soul. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of everything changing. The morning sun filtered gently through the long windows, casting golden lines across the marble floor. But the warmth of the light did not reach Yusef's heart. He stood alone in the center of his study, surrounded by silence and symbols. Around him, a display of wealth carefully assembled. A diamond necklace nestled in a velvet box, shoes that cost more than most people earned in a year, a silk dress that shimmered like water, and a black key, sleek, modern, a ticket to a life others only dreamed of. These were not gifts. These were attempts. Bridges, perhaps, or distractions. He had planned it all with precision, as he always did. He knew the power of opulence, knew how to dazzle, to impress, to silence doubt with luxury. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a deal. This was Mariam, and Mariam was not for sale. Still, a voice inside him whispered, maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something redemptive. When he heard her approaching, his pulse quickened. For a man used to commanding rooms, it felt strange. This nervousness, this hope laced with fear. She entered with the same quiet dignity she always carried. No makeup, no performance, just presence. "I asked them not to interrupt us," he said. She nodded, her eyes scanning the room, then landing gently on him. "I wanted to give you something," he said, gesturing to the array of gifts. "Something that might, I don't know, mean something." She walked over, slowly, deliberately. Her fingers hovered over the necklace, brushed against the silk. She picked up the car key, turned it over once, then set it down without a word. He watched her, waiting for any sign, a smile, a flicker of approval, even anger. But she was still. Then she turned to face him. "I know you're trying," she said softly, "but you still don't understand." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "This," she said, motioning to the gifts, "is how the world taught you to say I'm sorry. But I don't need a sorry wrapped in ribbon. I need one that's lived." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. Each word settled in the room like dust on ancient books. "For so long," she continued, "I've been reduced to what I can offer. My silence, my body, my compliance. You may not have used force, but you took something sacred without asking. My personhood." He flinched. "You didn't know," she said. "But you didn't ask either." She turned away from him and looked out the window. "I've spent nights wondering if I mattered, if anyone saw me, beyond what I could endure." Then quieter, "You don't fix that with shoes." Yusef's hands trembled slightly. He clenched them to still the shaking. "I wanted to undo the harm," he said, voice raw. "I didn't know how else to begin." She looked back at him, eyes no longer hard but tired. "Kind, honest. You begin by no longer trying to undo," she said. "You begin by letting the wound teach you." He stepped closer, but carefully, as if the space between them were sacred ground. "I don't expect you to take these things," he said. I wanted to say, I see you now." She studied him. "Then prove it," she said. "Not with what you give, but with what you give up." He furrowed his brow. "Give up the man who thinks people are prizes. Give up the comfort of control. Give up the story where you are the hero because you tried to fix what your pride destroyed." Silence followed. Then she added, "Be someone who listens more than he speaks, who asks before he assumes, who serves without needing credit." Her words were a mirror, and Yusef saw himself in it, not as a villain, but as a man terribly unformed, a man who had mastered business and lost his own heart in the process. "Mariam," he said, his voice almost breaking. "Do you think I can be better?" "I don't know," she answered. "But I believe you can become true, and that matters more." She turned to leave, then stopped, as if something unfinished hung between them. She turned back. "For what it's worth," she said gently, "I forgive you." He felt those words in his chest like a collapse and a healing all at once. "Not because you earned it," she continued, "but because I need my soul back." And with that she walked out, leaving behind every symbol of wealth, but taking her freedom and leaving the door open for something Youssef had never known before, a life that could not be bought, only lived. The days after Mariam's forgiveness passed like shadows, long, quiet, and heavy with something unspoken. Youssef tried to return to routine, board meetings, calls, signatures, flights, but none of it felt real anymore. The things that once gave him power now tasted hollow. The meetings felt like echoes, the contracts like distractions. The people around him, models, assistants, admirers, felt like actors reading lines from a script he no longer believed in. He started skipping events, then canceling trips. Eventually, he just stayed in the palace, wandering its vastness like a ghost. Every hallway reminded him of her. Every room held a silence shaped like Mariam. And in the absence of her presence, he was finally left alone with the one person he had avoided all his life, himself. It was unbearable. He thought about calling her, thought about writing letters, thought about begging for another conversation, but something inside him whispered that this next step was not about reaching for her. It was about reaching for truth, and truth did not wear silk suits or drink vintage wine. Truth lived in the desert, and Youssef was in one. He stopped entertaining guests. He dismissed most of the staff, his chefs, his tailors, his stylists, all told to leave. For the first time in years, the palace was quiet, painfully quiet. He would walk from room to room at night, staring at the gold-framed mirrors, wondering who the man staring back at him really was. Sometimes he didn't recognize him. Sometimes he did, and that was worse. At night, he began to have dreams, not of Mariam, but of himself, small, afraid, standing in the corner of a lavish room as people walked by him without seeing. In those dreams, he was always holding something in his hands, a cracked cup, a broken watch, an empty frame, things that used to hold value, now just fragments. And always he would hear a voice in the dream, quiet, but clear. "Who are you?" when no one's watching. He didn't have an answer. The silence grew unbearable, not the kind that brings peace, the kind that presses into the chest like a question waiting to be answered. One evening he wandered into the library and saw something he hadn't noticed in years, a small wooden box tucked behind old leather-bound volumes. Inside, a photo, himself, as a child, standing beside his grandmother. She had one hand on his shoulder and another on a small Bible. Her eyes were kind. Her voice echoed in his memory. "Never let your heart become richer than your soul." He hadn't understood back then. He did now. That night he went to the chapel, not because he wanted to pray, but because it was the only place that didn't lie. The candle she had lit weeks ago was gone, but the scent lingered, faint, like memory. He sat in the back pew and stared at the wooden cross above the altar. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. There was no thunder, no voice, no miracle, just the stillness, and for once, he didn't try to fill it. He sat there for hours until the stars moved, until the night faded into a deep blue silence, and that's when something inside him shifted, not all at once, not dramatically, but honestly. He began waking earlier, reading, walking the gardens, noticing things, the sound of birds, the texture of silence, the ache of his own loneliness. He started listening to sermons online, not the loud ones, not the angry ones, but the quiet ones, the ones that talked about mercy and dignity and second chances. He bought a Bible, didn't read it much at first, just kept it near, like a reminder, like a promise. Then one night he opened it to a verse that shook him. "To whom much is given, much will be required." He closed it slowly, the weight of those words pressing into his chest like a truth he had always known but never faced. He had been given everything, and maybe for the first time in his life, he was ready to give something back, but not through donations, not through charity galas, through change, through becoming someone new. Not because he wanted Mariam to love him, but because he wanted to love himself and couldn't until he became someone worth that love. There were days he felt like quitting, days the guilt returned like waves, days he questioned if it was too late. But then he remembered her voice, firm, calm, full of boundaries and grace. You can't undo, but you can begin again. So he did. Slowly, he started writing in a journal. Thoughts, questions, prayers, regrets. He started speaking to his staff like people, not tools. He started noticing his own breathing, the way his body held tension, the way his tone had shaped people for years. He started saying thank you, and meaning it. He still hadn't reached out to Mariam. He didn't feel ready. Because this time it wasn't about proving he had changed. It was about truly becoming someone different. His desert didn't end that week, or that month. But slowly, gently, it began to rain. Not from the sky, but from his soul. And the man who had once lived off applause was learning the beauty of silence. It wasn't a business trip. It wasn't for pleasure. It was something else entirely. Youssef boarded the flight without his usual entourage. No assistant with an itinerary. No stylist. No private chef. Just him. A single bag. And a heart finally tired of avoiding the truth. He was going to the place Mariam had come from. Not to make a statement. Not to earn credit. To understand. She had once mentioned the neighborhood. Quietly, in passing. With more pain than pride. A place of survival. Of resilience. Of invisible women and overlooked children. A place he had never been. A world he had never cared to see. Until now. The flight was short. The car ride, longer. The city grew narrower. Louder. Realer. Glass towers gave way to concrete blocks. Luxury boutiques faded into corner stores. The streets lost their gloss. But Youssef didn't feel fear. He felt reverence. This wasn't a charity mission. It was a pilgrimage. When the driver stopped in front of a modest building, Youssef stepped out slowly. The structure was old but cared for. Its paint faded, its windows open. Music drifted from somewhere. Children laughed below. The smell of fried bread and laundry soap filled the air. He asked for Mariam's sister. A neighbor pointed. Another offered to walk him up. But he declined. Some things had to be walked alone. At the door, he hesitated, then knocked. It opened slowly. She stared at him. Expression unreadable. The man who had once taken her sister's freedom now stood before her in plain clothes, no arrogance in sight. I'm Youssef, he said, voice low. Mariam's passed. A pause. Then with reluctant grace she stepped aside. The apartment was small, a living room filled with mismatched furniture, hand-stitched curtains, a table with uneven legs. But it was warm. Lived in. Honest. She told me you might come, her sister said. Not for her, but for the truth. Youssef nodded. He looked around. Photos on the wall. Drawings from children. A shelf of worn books. It wasn't wealth, but it was richness. She used to pray for you, she continued, setting tea on the table. Even when I told her you didn't deserve it. He said nothing. What could he say? She said no one is too far gone if they're still willing to listen. He looked down at his hands. That's why I'm here. She sat across from him. So listen. And he did. For hours. About Mariam's childhood. The father who left. The mother who fought for dignity until her last breath. The way Mariam learned to survive not by shutting down, but by holding on to light, her dreams, her prayers, her refusal to be hardened by pain. She used to go up to the roof at night, her sister said, smiling faintly. Said the stars reminded her she was part of something bigger, that maybe God wasn't done with her yet. He asked about her music, her favorite foods, the way she used to leave small notes of encouragement inside borrowed library books so other girls would know they weren't alone. He learned about her part-time jobs, her late-night studies, her silent battles with self-worth. Tears welled in Youssef's eyes. I never knew, he said, because you never asked. The words weren't cruel. They were true. She handed him a photo. Mariam, maybe 17, arms around 2 children, barefoot in a dusty courtyard. Her smile wide, her eyes full of life. She never stopped being this girl, her sister whispered, even when she was afraid. He held the photo like it was sacred. Did she ever talk about me? only that she saw something in you. Not the power, not the money, just the boy beneath the armor. He breathed slowly as if trying to inhale every broken piece of her story and let it remake him. I'm not here to get her back, he said. I know. I'm here to become someone she wouldn't have to forgive. Her sister studied him. Then don't waste the chance. He paused before leaving. What would she say if she knew I came? I think, she said softly, she'd say grace is never wasted, even if it takes time to bloom. He stood at the doorway, eyes full, soul trembling. Before you go, she added, come to the rooftop, just once. She used to sit there for hours. He followed her upstairs. The door opened to a small rooftop, quiet, cracked tiles underfoot. He looked up. The sky was wide open, endless. She said the stars reminded her that nothing is ever too far to return. He sat down. The breeze was cool. The sounds of the street below faded. In that moment, he didn't feel like a man trying to atone. He felt like a boy meeting himself for the first time. He stayed for a long time, silent, watching the sky change colors, watching the sun bow slowly behind old rooftops and tangled wires. And when he stood to leave, he took one last look at the place she had once called sanctuary and whispered, thank you, not to her sister, not even to Mariam, but to God, for letting him begin again. 2 years passed. Time didn't rush. It whispered. It healed slowly, without permission, without fanfare. In those years, Mariam built something sacred, a home that wasn't hers alone, but one she shared with women who, like her, had been silenced, scarred, broken. The shelter didn't have marble floors or golden chandeliers. It had chipped walls, soft blankets, and voices that trembled until they learned to sing again. She led with presence, not power. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was like balm, like prayer. Her eyes had seen too much. But they no longer wept with grief. They wept with grace. The past hadn't left her, but it no longer led her. She taught classes on boundaries, on healing, on the worth of a soul. She lit candles every morning and prayed, not for escape, but for strength, for the courage to stay present, to not shut down, to not become bitter. She forgave every day, not because it was easy, but because she refused to let her soul rot under the weight of what others had done. Each woman who walked through the door came carrying her own storm. Mariam didn't stop the storms. She just offered shelter. One morning, she was arranging books in the small reading room when a voice at the door made her still. It wasn't loud, but it was familiar. Mariam. She turned slowly. There he was. Youssef. But not the Youssef she remembered. His hair was shorter. His clothes were plain. His eyes, they didn't demand anything. They asked. Permission. Presence. Forgiveness. He stepped forward, but not too close. I didn't come to disrupt anything, he said. She nodded once, silent. I just wanted to see what Grace looked like up close. Her breath caught. He looked around. The shelter, the women passing by, the walls filled with quotes and notes and names. This place, it's holy, he said softly. She didn't respond, because there was nothing to explain. The holiness was real, earned, breathed into life by every tear, every boundary, every silent night of prayer. I work at a food kitchen now, he said, 3 nights a week. The rest I spend studying, learning. I'm still clumsy with Grace, but I'm trying. She nodded again. He didn't ask for a response. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. Not even your friendship. Silence. I just wanted to say thank you for not letting my worst moment define me forever, for seeing someone in me when I didn't. She finally spoke. I didn't see someone in you, she said gently. I saw someone under everything you used to be. He breathed out, and in that breath something left him. Shame, perhaps, expectation, the need to perform. I brought something, he said, reaching into his coat. It's not a gift, just something I carry. He handed her a small leather-bound book, a journal. She opened it. Inside were entries, letters, prayers, some for her, most for himself, honest, unfiltered, sacred. She closed it carefully. Can I help? He asked, nodding toward the kitchen where lunch preparations were underway. She studied him. He didn't flinch under her gaze. You can peel carrots? she said finally. He smiled and followed. That afternoon, Youssef worked quietly. He peeled, he chopped, he washed dishes. No one treated him like royalty. No one asked for selfies. He was just a man with a knife, a sink, and a willingness to serve. And in that space, something beautiful bloomed. Not romance, not redemption, but rhythm, human rhythm. He returned the next day, and the next. He fixed a leaky faucet, painted a wall, carried groceries, sat with children, swept floors. He stayed late to help organize the pantry. He asked questions. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't perform goodness, he practiced it. And the women, they noticed. Not because he was once rich, but because he was present, because he was consistent, because he didn't pity them, he respected them. Weeks passed. The women began to trust him, not because of his name, but because he showed up, without agenda, without ego, just presence. He wasn't trying to be impressive, he was trying to be useful, and that, in the kingdom of the broken, was everything. One evening, after a long day of repairs, he sat alone in the chapel at the back of the shelter. The chapel was small, simple, lit by candlelight and silent prayers. Mariam walked in. He stood. "No need," she said. "This place doesn't need princes. Just people." He sat. She joined him. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but whole. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said, "but I'm no longer afraid of starting at zero." She looked at him. "That's where all things sacred begin." He turned to her, eyes soft. "I was never worthy of your love." "You weren't," she said, "but you are worthy of grace." He nodded. No defense, no denial. Just peace. She stood, walked to the altar and lit a candle. He followed. Not as a man hoping to be chosen, but as one learning how to kneel. And in the soft glow of that flame, two people stood, no longer prisoner and captor, just two souls, relearning what it meant to be whole, not through possession, but through presence. Later, as the others left for the night, Mariam stayed behind. She sat by the window, watching the wind move through the leaves. Youssef joined her, quiet, peaceful. He didn't speak. She didn't need him to. And in that silence, something was rebuilt. Not a relationship, a reverence, for healing, for change, for the long, slow work of becoming someone new. "I used to think God wouldn't want someone like me," he whispered. She looked at him. "He doesn't want who we pretend to be," she said. "He wants what's underneath." And finally, Youssef believed it. Not because she said it, but because she had lived it. And let him watch. Let him learn. Let him love. Not her, but truth, grace, humility, and maybe one day something more. But only if it was born from peace, not need, from healing, not debt. And until that day came, if it ever did, he would serve. He would build. He would become. Not to win her back, but to never lose himself again. It happened on a quiet morning. No thunder, no announcement, no crowd. Just Mariam, sweeping the front steps of the shelter before the others awoke. The sun had barely stretched across the sky. The air smelled like wet soil and early grace. She wasn't expecting anything that day, not a visitor, not a revelation, and certainly not a box. But there it was, small, wooden, carefully placed on the stone edge beside the chapel door. She picked it up slowly like it might whisper. No name, no note outside, just the weight of intention. She carried it inside, sat by the window, and opened the lid. Inside, a ring. Simple, a small round band. No diamonds, no brand, no show. Just a note folded beside it, handwritten, on plain paper. "To the beloved daughter of God," it said. No signature, no request, no question. Just a phrase, honoring who she was, not what he hoped she'd become. For a moment she didn't move. She simply breathed. And with each breath, memories came. Not loud ones, quiet ones. Moments of him helping in the kitchen, scraping paint off the wall, laughing gently with the children, wiping tears from a girl too young to carry that kind of sorrow. Moments of silence in the chapel. Of him sitting alone, eyes closed, lips moving slowly in prayer. Of her watching, not judging, not hoping, just witnessing. It had been nearly a year since he first showed up again. No declarations, no pressure, just presence. He never once asked her to love him again. And perhaps that's why something inside her had started to soften. Because he wasn't trying to take. He was trying to give. Not to her. To life. To the parts of himself he'd buried beneath image and wealth and fear. And now, this. A ring. And a note. Not asking anything. Just honoring something. She closed the lid. Her fingers lingered over the wood, tracing the edge as if trying to feel what words could never hold. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. Deep. Long. Grateful. Later that day, she didn't mention it to anyone. She didn't call him. Didn't return the box. She kept it by her bed, not as a promise of romance, but as proof that people could change, that hearts could break open without bleeding into violence, that sometimes the most radical thing a person could do was not ask for love, but offer it, unwrapped, unforced, unbargained. Days passed, then weeks. She continued to see him at the shelter, quiet, steady, invisible in all the right ways. He never brought it up, never asked. One afternoon, she found him outside with the maintenance crew, fixing a broken gutter. He was muddy, focused, kind. She brought him water. He looked up, smiled. "Thank you," he said, taking the cup. She sat beside him on the steps. "You left something," she said. His eyes didn't widen. He didn't look startled. He just nodded slowly. "I didn't expect anything." "I know." She paused. "Why now?" "Because I needed you to know that I meant it, that I became someone better, not for a reward, but because I finally saw what I was meant to be." She looked down at the ground. "You've changed. I'm still changing. That's even better." They sat in silence. Then she asked, "What would you do if I never put it on?" He looked at her, eyes gentle. "Exactly what I'm doing now." She nodded. That night, she lit a candle in the chapel, sat alone for a long time, then walked to the altar and placed the ring beside it, not because she was rejecting it, but because she needed to return it to God first, not to romance, but to purpose, to humility, to the sacred silence between healing and hope. In the weeks that followed, they continued as they were. He served. She led. They shared silence, not pressure. And with time, something wholly unfolded, not rushed, not claimed, but welcomed. One day, she found the ring again, this time on her bookshelf, and without thinking, she slipped it on, not as a wife, but as a woman who understood that love is not possession. It is presence. It is service. It is showing up again and again without needing applause. He saw it on her hand weeks later. He didn't say anything. He just noticed and smiled because he knew what it meant. It didn't mean yes, it meant, "I see you." It didn't mean now. It meant still here. It didn't mean romance. It meant resurrection of what had been broken, of what had died, of what had been buried under shame and ego and fear. They never made announcements, never invited the world in, but the shelter noticed. The women smiled, and the children who had once drawn sad faces with broken crayons now drew two people side by side, not kissing, just standing, together, whole, seen, safe. And in the chapel, every night, the candle she lit flickered just a little longer, because sometimes love returns, not as a storm, but as a whisper, not as a rescue, but as a reminder that grace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives when we stop asking to be chosen and start choosing to become, for real, for good, forever. Mariam didn't go back to him, not in the way people expect. There was no dramatic reunion, no romantic montage, no wedding dress, no kiss under the rain, because she didn't need a fairy tale. She had already lived a resurrection. She had already been restored, not by a man, but by mercy. What Yusuf gave her in the end wasn't a ring or redemption. It was distance, boundaries, peace, the space to continue being herself without being claimed. He kept showing up, in the background, at the shelter, in the kitchen, by the door, but never at the center, because he understood now. She was never his to center. She belonged to something far greater, to something sacred, and that made her whole. It took time, but eventually they shared coffee in the morning. Not every day, just enough. He told her about the boy he used to be, how lonely he'd felt, even surrounded by gold, how every success had felt like a failure wearing perfume. She told him about the moments she wanted to disappear, not because she hated life, but because she felt forgotten by it. They didn't rush the conversations. They let silence speak. They let their stories find rhythm. Over time, trust grew, not the kind that asks for possession, the kind that says, "You can be free beside me." He never touched her hand without asking. She never gave more than she had. And in that sacred balance, something invisible took root, something without pressure, something that didn't need a name. They were not rebuilding what they once had. They were building something new, with bricks made of patience, with mortar of truth, with architecture that honored limits, not just longings. One evening she stood in the chapel again, alone. She had just finished a session with one of the girls, a 17-year-old who'd run from home thinking pain was all she deserved. They had cried together, laughed a little too, and now Mariam stood before the altar. The candle flickered, and she whispered, "Thank you," not because her life was perfect, not because the pain was gone, but because she had survived without becoming bitter. She had walked through fire and hadn't turned to ash. She had been broken, but not erased, and that she now knew was a miracle. She turned, walked toward the door, and saw him there, leaning against the frame. He didn't speak. She didn't startle. They simply looked at each other. Two souls, wiser, quieter, whole. And maybe that's all heaven ever wanted. Not a perfect story, but a true one. Not a prince saving a girl, but a woman finding her crown. Not a man returning to claim love, but learning to carry it. In silence, in service, in surrender. Some days they shared meals. Other days they shared only glances. But always they shared truth. And slowly, gently, the world around them began to change. The shelter grew. More women came. More healing happened. One day a little girl asked Mariam, "Is he your husband?" Mariam smiled. "No, sweetie, he's just someone who's learning to love well." The girl blinked. "That's better," she said. Mariam laughed. And in that laugh, decades of pain softened into grace. Years passed. Youssef kept serving. He never left again, never returned to his empire. His empire had become this: a room of women finding their voices, a kitchen full of laughter, a chapel where tears didn't mean weakness, but worship. He carried groceries, painted walls, studied scripture, carried children who didn't carry his name. And no one outside knew his story, but heaven did, and Mariam did. She watched him become someone free from performance. She watched him unlearn pride. She watched him forgive himself, not through denial, but through service. And somewhere in that watching, she softened, not out of need, but out of knowing. That transformation is not loud. It is daily, quiet, sacred. He never asked her for a title, never called her mine. He called her light, teacher, sister, and eventually, friend. It was enough, until the day it became something more. Not because of pressure, but because of purpose. They stood side by side at the shelter's 10th anniversary. Volunteers gathered. Former residents returned. There was music, laughter, a meal. Mariam gave a speech. Youssef didn't. He stayed behind the scenes, serving, as always. But that night he sat beside her, and for the first time took her hand. She didn't pull away, because it wasn't about romance, it was about reverence. And in that moment she knew. She wasn't being asked to forget the past. She was being invited to honor it, by choosing what came next. Not out of fear, but out of faith. And when people asked Mariam if she ever got the guy, she'd smile and say, "No, I got myself back." And he found himself too. And that was more than enough, because she wasn't waiting for a prince. She had been crowned by grace, and that crown, it never came off, even in silence, even in shadows, even when no one else saw, because heaven always did. And that was the ending she never knew she needed, the one where she wasn't saved, but seen. But what if I told you? Mariam wasn't the only one who discovered that heaven hides its miracles in the most unexpected places. In another city, another woman, unseen, unheard, forgotten, opened her door to a stranger. She thought he was just another broken soul looking for bread. But what he really needed was something no money could ever buy. And what she gave him changed both of their lives forever. Because sometimes the unthinkable doesn't come to destroy, it comes to redeem. Watch now. He paid a homeless woman to bear his child. Then came the unthinkable.